It's the basic fact that the resurrection of Jesus took place, and that resurrection actually is the only way of living again after death as taught in the Bible. Looking for some internal evidence, really, from the Bible to build up that case. And I suppose we could, to some extent, just say from the outset, well, you can be sure that Jesus was resurrected because that's what the Bible teaches, and the Bible is the Word of God. It is authentic, it's a reliable source of information, it's true. But obviously we want to look a bit further than that. We hope to delve a bit closer and see, as we say, that resurrection generally is the only way of living again, and that see some internal evidence as to why that is the case, so that we can be sure that Jesus was definitely resurrected. So before we specifically look at Jesus, what we want to do first is to just establish that this fact that resurrection is the only means of living after death as taught in the Bible, whether that's the Old Testament or the New Testament. To see that both the Old and the New Testament scriptures support resurrection. And so we're going to look in the Old Testament at a case study. We're just going to look very briefly at a case study of David, and then just again very briefly just see that what David believed concerning resurrection is consistent throughout the Old Testament. And then also just a quick case study in the New Testament, looking at the case of Lazarus, and then also just to say that it's consistent, that's consistent teaching in the New Testament. And then we'll move on specifically to Jesus. So the case study of David, we've just tried to put a table together there just to try and demonstrate this. Hopefully you can read it. But David is a prominent example in the Old Testament. He was the king of Israel. So let's just look at some of the things that he wrote and some things that were written about him. We've just read some of them in Acts chapter 2 from that reading, haven't we? And the fact that he believed in resurrection. So Psalm 6, the first quote we've got on there, which is written by David, that he said, "In death there is no remembrance of thee, in the grave who shall give thee thanks?" There's no reward in death, in the grave. That was David's view, his belief. And he went on, Psalm 13, verse 3, "Consider and hear me, O Lord my God, lighten mine eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death." To David, death was a sleep. That's what he understood death to be. And then we read in the historical account in the Bible, in the first book of Kings, chapter 2, of David, that when he died, it was described as a death. David slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David. He slept with his fathers, and he remains in the sleep of death. And that's really one of the things that came out in this reading that we just took from Acts chapter 2, that the Apostle Peter was saying that the things that David wrote, things that he had said, that may have given the impression that he was going to be with Jesus after death. No, he was talking prophetically, because he understood that Jesus was going to be resurrected. That's what we've just read, isn't it? Agrees with Jesus' teaching that Jesus was the only person to be resurrected, and it was specifically, we just read that David is not ascended to the heavens, but he lived in hope of resurrection. And then in this passage in Hebrews chapter 11, David is mentioned in that chapter as one of many that received a good report through faith, but they received not the promise, God having provided some better thing for us, that they without us should not be made perfect. So faithful men and women, like David, never obtained what God promised them, but they would receive that inheritance, that promise, when the faithful of all ages receive it. No one would receive it first before others. They would all receive that promise together, which is the promise of resurrection. So that's very quickly a case study of David, just to understand and see that this Old Testament example, that if anything was looked for beyond death, it was resurrection. And then there's some other examples we've just quoted up here. So Abraham, another prominent figure of the Old Testament, he believed in resurrection. Hebrews 11, verse 17, verse 19 tells us that. It's speaking about Abraham. He accounted that God was able to raise him up even from the dead. Of Moses as well. It said in Luke chapter 20 that the dead are raised, even Moses showed at the bush, Jesus said. In Isaiah 26 and verse 19, we see that he believed in resurrection. "Thy dead men shall live, together with my dead body shall they arise." And Daniel also just a few that we've picked out. Daniel 12 verse 2, that many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life. So it's a consistent message, a consistent teaching of the Bible. If there's a hope of living again after death, it's resurrection. And so maybe we can start to understand that if Jesus was going to live after death, it would be resurrection. We can rely upon that. But it's consistent in the New Testament as well. So this case study we've mentioned with Lazarus and Martha. Lazarus was a close friend of Jesus. Martha gave the news to Jesus that Lazarus was very sick and that Jesus was to come. But by the time Jesus came, got to their village and got to them, Lazarus was already dead. And long and the short of it is the key part of the conversation is this verse 23, that Jesus saith unto her, Thy brother shall rise again. And Martha said unto him, I know that he shall rise again in the resurrection in the last day. So that was early Christian belief. It was a belief in life after death, resurrection at the last day. And it wasn't only Martha that believed it, but many others saw the things that Jesus did and they believed on him. John 11 verse 45. So they believed because they had good reason to. They had evidence, proof. They could see with their own eyes that resurrection had taken place in the case of Lazarus here. So hopefully, just very quickly, seeing that it's a consistent teaching of the Bible, that if there's a hope of life after death, it is resurrection. And when we come to the New Testament, we could put loads of verses on here. We've just put a couple from the Apostle Paul. We'll perhaps just read one of them. This one from Acts chapter 17. Paul taught, He hath appointed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness. Speaking of God, He hath appointed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness by that man whom he hath ordained, whereof he hath given assurance unto all men, in that he hath raised him from the dead. So he's talking about Jesus, the one that God has ordained to judge the world in righteousness, and he raised him from the dead. So this is consistent teaching in the New Testament of the resurrection of Jesus. So that's really just quickly skimmed through that bit of background, really, just to show that resurrection is taught throughout the Bible. It's consistently taught as the only way to live after death. So let's move on to think a little bit more specifically about Jesus then. And just before we really get into that, I've just put this in the presentation as an aside almost, really. But it's something I always remember from my school days. I don't remember that many things now. It's getting further in the distance. But I can remember an RE lesson, religious education lesson at school, when we were looking at the crucifixion of Jesus, and the teacher said that the fact that blood and water came out when the soldier pierced Jesus' side, that was proof that he was dead. And so more recently, I'm sort of remembering that, I thought, I'm going to have a quick look into that. And as we can so easily these days with the internet, I found that apparently, yes, it's a medically proven fact that when the body is suspended, the weight of the body is suspended purely on the arms. Jesus might have had his feet pierced as well, but obviously there's only a certain length of time. That's all part of the inhumane death by crucifixion. That you try and bear your body on your feet or your arms, and eventually you have to on your arms, and that causes immense strain on the chest muscles, and they start to leak bodily fluids into the lungs without getting too much detail, which causes lung function to be lost, and it's known apparently medically as a pulmonary edema. And so it appears to be a fact that by the blood and water coming out from the side of Jesus, that it indicates that he was dead. And not only that, but perhaps also it just indicates, it's just an indication to us that we can have confidence that the gospel accounts are a very straightforward account, an eyewitness account of what happened. They might not have even understood why blood and water came out. That's why it was recorded. It was a strange thing. Or maybe the soldiers did that because they knew that if water came out, it meant the person being crucified was dead. One way or another, we know that it means that Jesus definitely died. So let's really move on to the subject. I suppose when we talk about resurrection, really, and in these days, it puts us out of our comfort zone, doesn't it? And people tend to say, well, I don't believe it. I've never seen it before. It's not something we have any experience of. And that's exactly what happened in the case of Thomas, one of Jesus' disciples. He said, except I shall see in his hands the print of the nails, put my finger into the print of the nails and thrust my hand into his side, I will not believe. And he was fortunate in that he did meet Jesus and was able to see him and did believe. And Jesus acknowledged, though, in verse 29 of John chapter 20, blessed are they that have not seen and yet have believed. Only a relative few in a grand scheme of things that saw Jesus. But Jesus acknowledged that there would be many more that would believe without seeing him. So how can we believe without seeing Jesus? Well, faith, of course, is required. It's not blind faith. That's not what's required. It's not faith. It's not just believing it with no evidence, and that's really what we're wanting to look at a bit today. There's a well-known verse in the book of Hebrews, the first verse of chapter 11. Our faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. That's in the authorised version. If we put it into one of the more modern versions, faith is being sure of what we hope for, being convinced of what we do not see. And so we might ask the question, well, how can we be convinced of what we haven't seen for ourselves? And the only answer really is that we have to rely on the authority, on a very good authority, by hearing, by receiving something on very good authority. And that's what we have to rely on in the case of Jesus. We haven't seen the resurrected Jesus with our own eyes, but we have the next best thing. We have the witness, the evidence of those that did see him. And so what we're going to do really in the remainder of our talk is call upon three witnesses, really, that did see Jesus. It's actually a principle in the Bible. In Deuteronomy chapter 19 we find it. In verse 15, that at the mouth of two witnesses, or at the mouth of three witnesses, shall the matter be established. So we're going to look specifically at three people, three New Testament characters, and see what we can learn from them in connection with Jesus' resurrection. And can we be more sure that Jesus' resurrection took place because of the things that they did and they said? And the three that we're going to look at, we find mentioned in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. We've got the verses on the screen. 1 Corinthians 15, between verses 4 and 8. Just pick up in that verse on the screen there, that he, talking about Jesus, he was buried, he rose again the third day according to the scriptures, and that he was seen of Cephas. That's a reference to Peter. Cephas was another name that Jesus gave to Peter. He was seen of Peter, then of the 12. After that he was seen of above 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain until this present, but some have fallen asleep. After that he was seen of James, then of all the apostles, and last of all he was seen of me also, Paul. So there's three named there, key, prominent characters of the New Testament: Peter, James and Paul, and they're the ones that we just want to think about for a few minutes this evening. So let's think about Peter first of all. What did Peter say about the resurrection of Jesus? Well, in Acts chapter 2 we took a reading from there, didn't we? But generally in that chapter we find Peter making a very public proclamation concerning the resurrected Jesus. It was an occasion, the day of Pentecost, one of the big feasts in Jerusalem, so there were Jews from all over the region assembled in Jerusalem, one of the busiest times of the year. And he makes this proclamation. It's probably only a few weeks after the resurrection of Jesus. Let's just read those words that we've picked out there. That Peter said unto them, unto this assembled crowd, this multitude, Jesus of Nazareth, ye have taken and by wicked hands have crucified and slain, whom God hath raised up. He, seeing this before, spake of the resurrection of Christ. This Jesus hath God raised up, whereof we are all witnesses. So we've just picked some of the key words out there, but that's the message that that Peter was getting across at this time, that very clearly announcing that Jesus had been resurrected. So that's what he said. We might just for a minute, it might seem a bit of a strange thing to say, but to think about, but what did Peter not say? What did he not do on this occasion? He didn't call forward any witnesses to Jesus' resurrection, did he? He didn't say Jesus has been resurrected and here are the women that came to the tomb and found the tomb empty and they will vouch for what I'm saying. There was nothing like that, because there were 500 plus eyewitnesses. We read that in passage in Corinthians, didn't we? Because the resurrection of Jesus was a notorious fact. It was undisputed. All the people to whom he spoke knew that it had taken place. These 500 people, this news would soon get around, wouldn't it? And there's an interesting verse, we haven't got it on presentation, but it's in Luke 24 and verse 18, when a couple of disciples spoke to Jesus. They didn't know it was Jesus at the time. It was shortly after his resurrection. And he asked them what they were talking about. They were talking about all the things that had happened to Jesus. And they said to him, in the ESV it says, are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened in these days? Jesus asking that question, and they couldn't believe. What do you mean? What are we talking about? Everyone knows the things that have been happening to this Jesus. And so surely that's what was happening in Acts chapter 2. There was no need for any witnesses to come forward on that occasion. Everyone understood and knew what Peter was talking about. And it had this marvellous effect on 3,000 people in that crowd. We read that in Acts 2 verse 41. And they that gladly received his word were baptized, and the same day there were added unto them about 3,000 souls. Such wholesale acceptance of Peter's preaching was based upon the resurrection of Jesus. It wouldn't have happened if they weren't all convinced of Jesus' resurrection. And when Peter explained the implication of the resurrection of Jesus to these people, they acted instinctively upon his word. So actually it wasn't just 3 witnesses, 3 apostles that we could turn to. It wasn't even just the 12 disciples. It wasn't even just the 500, but there were these thousands of people that were so convinced in Jesus' resurrection at the time that their lives were changed by that fact. We're just thinking still about Peter before we move on to the others. There was this post-resurrection effect on Peter. He did once say to Jesus that he would go to prison and to death for Jesus' sake. It's recorded in Luke 22, verse 33. Peter said unto him, Lord, I am ready to go with thee both into prison and to death. Well, he did. Such was his conviction in the resurrected Jesus. He was imprisoned. We can read of that in Acts chapter 12. And he was most probably a martyr to his beliefs. There's a reference there to John chapter 21. Perhaps we'll just turn there quickly. We haven't got it on the screen. It's Jesus' words to Peter. So Jesus said to Peter, Verily, verily, I say unto you, when thou wast young, thou girdest thyself and walkest whither thou wouldest. But when thou shalt be old, thou shalt stretch forth thy hands, and another shall gird thee, and carry thee whither thou wouldest not. This spake he, signifying by what death he should glorify God. And when he had spoken this, he saith unto him, Follow me. So it suggests that Peter would lose his freedom and be led against his will to some unpleasant death. And according to Christian tradition, Peter was crucified in Rome. So in the case of Peter, as an example, as a witness, he seemed to have been very sure in his conviction, his belief in the resurrected Jesus. Wouldn't have done all that he did and die for his beliefs, if that were not the case. And so let's move on to our other two witnesses, to James and Paul. They're in a similar category, that we might say they're impartial witnesses, or even hostile witnesses. And their witness, really, the power of their witness, is by considering where they came from and what they changed to and why. Because they were not always pro-Jesus, as it were. And we'll just look at that quickly. So we've just kind of summarised this, really. We haven't got time to look at all these passages. But so thinking of James first, and the situation before Jesus' resurrection, his relationship to his brother. This is James, the brother of Jesus. In Mark chapter 3 and verse 21, this isn't the ESV, but James's view of Jesus was that he was out of his mind. There's this occasion when his family heard what Jesus was doing at this certain time, and they went to find him, saying he's out of his mind. They certainly weren't his followers. And Jesus said himself, these words from Mark chapter 6 verse 4, that a prophet is honoured everywhere except in his own hometown and among his relatives and his own family. His own family were against him. They didn't recognise him for what he was. And John, in his gospel record, John 7 verse 5, clearly says that not even his own brothers believed in him. That was the situation during Jesus' life and his ministry upon the earth with regard to James, his brother. And looking at what he went to, he changed to, well, we've got a whole book written by the Apostle James. That's what he became. So Paul in Galatians refers to this fact that other of the apostles saw I none save James, the Lord's brother. So James, the Lord's brother, who thought he was out of his mind during his lifetime, had become a key apostle and supporter of Jesus in the church at Jerusalem. We can read many events, many occasions. Acts chapter 15 we might think of is a prominent one where James plays an important role in the church, in the ecclesia in Jerusalem. He's become a key figure. But he also, sadly, Jewish history has it recorded, Josephus, for instance, he died for his beliefs. There's a short quotation we've got from the writings of Josephus that James was brought before a Sanhedrin of judges, the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. There's different variations as to what exactly happened, but one of them is that he was thrown from the pinnacle of the temple. He wasn't dead, and so then he was stoned. But what a powerful witness, surely, to the fact that Jesus was resurrected. This man who lived, who was his brother, turned from thinking he was out of his mind, didn't believe in him, and turned to laying down his life for his belief in Jesus. Why was it? What was the pivotal point that caused this? Well, surely it was the fact that Jesus appeared to him after his resurrection. He'd seen his brother cruelly crucified, and yet afterwards, 3 or so days later, he had seen him alive. As is recorded by Paul in that chapter in 1 Corinthians 15. that he, Jesus, was buried and that he rose again the third day according to the Scriptures. After that, he was seen of James. He's one of our key witnesses. He saw Jesus. That's surely the reason. It's because Jesus appeared to James alive after he had witnessed his death by crucifixion. That's why he's a key witness for us. That's why he led the life he did. He changed to an apostle and turned his life into one of devotion to Jesus and support for his teaching. And it's a similar story with Paul, but perhaps even more extreme. James just thought his brother was a bit crazy, didn't believe him. But Paul, as we may well know from our knowledge of the Bible, he was a ringleader of a great persecution of the Christian church after Jesus' death. We can read of it, Acts chapter 8 and verse 3, we've got the quote there. As for Saul, he made havoc of the church, entering into every house and hailing men and women, committed them to prison. And Acts 22 and verse 19, we have Paul's own words, his own version of the terrible things he then later recognised he did. I said, Lord, they know that I imprisoned and beat in every synagogue them that believed on thee. And when the blood of thy martyr Stephen was shed, I also was standing by and consenting unto his death. That's the Paul that we first learn of. But what did he change to? Well, if we have any knowledge of the Bible, we'll know that there are quite a large number of books in the New Testament written by Paul, letters, epistles. And we read of many of his actions in the book of the Acts of the Apostles. He completely changed to a forthright promoter of Christianity and the resurrection of Jesus. Come what may, nothing would stop him. Got this short quote from Romans 6 verse 8 to see that was clearly Paul taught that Jesus had been resurrected. Christ being raised from the dead dieth no more. That was now his new way of life, to teach that Jesus had been resurrected and the marvellous things therefore, the marvellous hope that brought to others. And as I say, he endured great trial and temptation, difficult life in order to carry out his preaching. And he speaks of it in his second letter that he wrote to the Corinthians, chapter 11 verse 3, speaking about others. Are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool. I am more, in labours more abundant, in stripes above measure, in prisons more frequent, in deaths oft. He lived in fear of his life often in order to preach Jesus, the resurrected Jesus. And there's an example there in Acts 14 and verse 19 where he was in death oft. He was left for dead. He was stoned and left for dead. There were certain Jews from Antioch and Iconium who persuaded the people, and having stoned Paul, drew him out of the city, supposing he had been dead. And it's a similar story. We don't know for sure, but Christian tradition holds that Paul was also martyred for his beliefs. He was beheaded in Rome. Probably don't need to ask this question, do we? But what was the pivotal point, the pivotal moment in Paul's life that caused this great transformation? He saw the resurrected Jesus. It's in that same passage, isn't it, that we read in Corinthians. That Jesus was buried, that he rose again the third day according to the Scriptures, and last of all he was seen of me, Paul, who was writing these things. It was because Jesus appeared to Paul alive after his death and resurrection that there was this great transformation in Paul's life. He couldn't do anything else. He couldn't deny the facts. He'd seen the man that had been crucified and dead for 3 days. He'd seen him alive again. And so, just a quick summary as we conclude then. What we've seen today, we've seen that the Old Testament consistently teaches resurrection as the only way to live again after death. We've seen that the New Testament also consistently teaches resurrection as the only way to live after death. If we take Jesus aside, Old Testament and New Testament all teach resurrection as the way to live after death. We've seen that Jesus definitely died, so to live again he would need to be resurrected as per the account. We haven't even actually referred to the gospel account, but one of them's in Matthew chapter 28, the resurrection account. But more, what we've been doing is considering reasons why we can be more sure that that was a fact. We've considered the witness of Peter and the fact that 3,000 people responded because of Jesus' resurrection being a notorious fact in those days. We've considered the witness of James, how he turned from an unbeliever to an apostle following Jesus' resurrection. And we've considered the witness of Paul. He turned from a persecutor of Christians to a persecuted preacher following Jesus' resurrection. And so we perhaps just leave us with a question. If you're sure that Jesus was resurrected, well, what next? Well, there's this marvellous passage in 1 Corinthians 15. That chapter continues. Let's just read these few verses from verse 20. But now is Christ risen from the dead? We can be sure it's a fact. Christ is risen from the dead. He's become the first fruits of them that slept. For since by man came death, by man came also the resurrection of the dead. For as in Adam all die, even so in Christ shall all be made alive, but every man in his own order. Christ the first fruits, afterward they that are Christ's at his coming. And that's that power of resurrection, isn't it? That because of Jesus' death and resurrection, we also, others after Christ, at his coming, can be a further harvest of the resurrection. We can live in hope of resurrection and eternal life at Jesus' coming in the kingdom of God. But to make ourselves eligible for that, we must be baptised to relate ourselves to Christ and all that he achieved. But that, of course, is another subject. Thank you.